Dysentery, cholera, and a trail of trash, the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail symbolized a transformative time of American history. The trek wasn't easy. Just because a family was traversing the Oregon Trail, that didn't necessarily mean their final destination was Oregon. Those journeying west had several prime locations in mind. After all, California was supposedly flooded with gold. By 1848, thousands of Americans were hoping to score their shot at wealth by heading toward the soon-to-be state. Most of them would arrive a year later and get a football team named after them. Settlers heading to California would follow the Oregon Trail only until they reached Idaho. From there, they'd be forced to contend with Nevada's scorching deserts and challenging mountains. Many Mormon travelers seeking refuge from religious persecution also made use of the Oregon Trail, but only after they reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. Mormon pioneers often preferred staying north of the Platte River in an effort to avoid competition and confrontations with non-Mormon travelers. From Fort Laramie, they'd embark on the Oregon Trail for nearly 400 miles before heading into the final stretch of their journey, 116 miles of terrible mountainous terrain that ultimately led to Utah. Overall, the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails were part of a larger emigrant network that joined together to create multiple routes westward. When thinking of the Oregon Trail, it might be easy to imagine a bloody period where travelers were locked in a cycle of conflict with any Native American tribe they came across. Yes, gruesome encounters did occur, but historical accounts show that fighting between the two groups was more of the exception than the rule. In fact, on the Oregon Trail, travelers and Native Americans were more often likely to engage in trade than they were to raise arms against one another, though they may not have engaged in the casual conversations that modern TV implies.
I like your horse.
During the early days of the Oregon Trail, when settlers began making the move toward the Pacific Northwest, Native American tribes more or less left wagon trains alone. While hostilities escalated after the outbreak of the Civil War, statistics don't tell a story of insistent violence. Between 1840 and 1860, Native American tribes likely killed around 362 emigrants, while the settlers trekking the Oregon Trail killed around 426 indigenous people. Statistically speaking, the thousands wandering westward on the Oregon Trail had much graver threats to worry about than a random raid from a nearby tribe. It may be a meme now, but dysentery wasn't a joke to the immigrants making the journey west. The Oregon Trail was riddled with terrible diseases that plagued travelers at every turn. Measles, influenza, scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, smallpox, cholera, and yes, our dear friend dysentery. All these stalked immigrants relentlessly as they crossed the 2,000-mile stretch westward. On the trail, the combination of terrible sanitary conditions, general exhaustion, and a lack of adequate drinking water created the perfect environment for these diseases to thrive. The National Park Service estimates that disease likely killed around 30,000 settlers. On top of all this, the medicine available to pioneers was more aligned with treating symptoms rather than causes. Whiskey, rum, vinegar, castor and peppermint oils, turpentine, and doses of opium were some of the remedies immigrants had to look forward to. Nothing like some dehydrating cures to get you over being dehydrated. No wonder so many perished. As if deadly diseases weren't enough to worry about, pioneers on the Oregon Trail also had to watch out for a wide range of fatal accidents. Fatigue was often a problem due to the poor conditions.
Where will I sleep?
Same place you're gonna sleep for the next 5 months? Under the wagon.
Long stretches of travel and general negligence led to many avoidable deaths. A firearm in the wrong hands could prove just as fatal as a disease for those joining a wagon train. Being killed by a sudden and unintended gun discharge was not exactly an uncommon occurrence. Drowning while attempting a rough river crossing was also all too real a possibility. Another terrifyingly common way to die was being crushed by a moving wagon, and this was especially true for children. Certain historical accounts cite tragic instances where a child's injured and infected limb had to be amputated without the use of any general anesthetic, only for the child to not survive the ordeal. Beginning in 1841, at least 300,000 settlers journeyed across the Oregon Trail. The white pioneers making the trek westward were empowered by the growing belief of manifest destiny, the philosophy rooted in the conviction that continental expansionism was an American right ordained by God. But such optimism was in spite of Native Americans and was certainly not meant to be felt by black pioneers, free or otherwise. Enslaved people, whether they wished to or not, had to follow the families they served across the Oregon Trail. Both free and enslaved African Americans had a nightmarish conundrum awaiting them in the territory. In 1844, Oregon had outlawed enslavement that gave settlers 3 years to free their enslaved people, while also enacting a series of laws that made it illegal for black people to live in Oregon. George Washington Bush, who was what they used to call a free person of color, left Missouri in 1844 with his Irish wife and 5 children for Oregon. Little did they all realize that the territory of Oregon had no care for their legal standing. They soon found out of something called the Lash Law, whereby any black person who remained in Oregon would receive at least 20 lashings. This caused Bush to lead his party north of the Columbia River, where he'd find his own land to settle in what is present-day Washington. With immigrants packing countless pounds and traveling for thousands of miles, it's only natural that the Oregon Trail led to the creation of its own unique economy. The average family trekking out west likely carried with them between 200 and 600 pounds of flour, 150 to 400 pounds of bacon, ample amounts of sugar, lard, and coffee, along with a broad assortment of other necessities. Frontier towns like Independence, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa had an absolute field day with pioneer families. Rival towns would employ messengers to travel east to talk trash about one another, all in an attempt to make sure their town gained the most traffic. Once settlers were in the frontier town, the merchants pounced, convincing families they needed anything and everything. Some things never change. Just as today, when one might overpack for a weekend road trip, settlers in the 1800s often overestimated just how much they'd need, or how much their animals and wagons could haul. The solution? Start tossing items out. This turned out to be a gold mine for prowling scavengers. All one needed to do was wait for a wagon train to leave a starting point like Independence and soon follow. They'd likely be met with a cast iron stove or barrels of food. Dumping provisions was simply a tragic reoccurring theme on the Oregon Trail. Wherever a wagon train went, it'd nearly always leave a trail of discarded supplies and goods.
That was my mother's.
I know.
It's only weight now.
In 2024, making a wrong turn or missing an exit is irritating. In 1800s America, when trekking westward, going the wrong way could mean a death sentence. And unfortunately for 19th century pioneers, they had a wide selection of guidebooks filled with misleading directions. American expansion out west meant that there was money to be made in the trail guide market. In early 1848, as soon as folks began hearing all that talk of gold in California, heaps and heaps of guides began being printed at a rapid rate. And of course, most of them were terrible. They eagerly gave flowery prose when it came to descriptions of their potential destinations, but in terms of legitimate directions on how to actually get there, they'd either offer nothing or just be flat out wrong. For example, pioneers would read that there'd be no water in one area, only to find a fresh spring once they arrived. Or much worse, the opposite. Such erroneous advice culminated in the tragedy of the Donner Party, an expedition that followed the unreliable writings of Lansford Hastings, the author of The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. Talking about the Oregon Trail conjures up images of hardy animals and sturdy wagons plodding along endless meadows, dirt passes, and rocky mountain terrain. It's true that both animals and vehicles served as indispensable tools for an emigrant's journey out west. However, this doesn't mean that most travelers had the luxury of hopping onto the wagon or atop a horse whenever they felt like it. Instead, the main mode of locomotion for many on the Oregon Trail, especially children, was endless walking. This meant a family's wagon could be packed with as much as possible. A ride inside the wagon wouldn't have exactly been a delight anyways. The paths out west weren't paved with any fancy network of roads, and it's not like the wagons were Toyota Camrys. Being crammed inside a crate on wheels with no suspension system was a wobbly nightmare. Overall, a good day for a wagon train was when it completed at least 18 miles. Emigrants on the Oregon Trail started around 4 in the morning and stopped to rest around 5 in the evening, which meant several hours of walking every day in unpredictable terrain, while likely wearing less than adequate footwear. For 2,000 miles and for several months, this is what an emigrant had to look forward to on the Oregon Trail. Add some dysentery on top of this hardship, and you've got yourself a terrible time. The 19th century wasn't a time when married women were making decisions about their household's future. If their husband wished to uproot the family's life and make the 2,000-mile trek across the Oregon Trail, then that was the end of it. On the trail itself, a woman's life was strenuous just like everyone else's, but maybe doubly so due to the work expected of them. Not only was it her duty to prepare the day's meals, often with limited supplies, but if her husband or other men in the wagon train fell ill, they'd soon find that they had to step up for guard duty. It also wasn't a rarity for women to partake in other manly jobs, such as herding the livestock and driving the wagon. Men were much more likely to be apprehensive and mindful about accidentally performing any task that was traditionally reserved for women. Indeed, the mere act of a husband fetching water for the day's laundry could garner camp attention. From tending to camp to caring for children to performing any and every task asked of them, women on the Oregon Trail were the ultimate unsung heroes. The real reason the Oregon Trail diminished in popularity was progress, namely the first transcontinental railroad. Somewhere around 12,000 Chinese immigrants, along with Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, built the railroad, linking Sacramento, California with Omaha, Nebraska. For the first time in the nation's history, the West truly met the East. And with more rail lines not far off, this meant saying a gradual goodbye to the Oregon Trail. In what originally may have taken pioneers 6 months, passengers could now arrive at their destination in mere days. Immigrants trekking the trail with their wagon trains were still a common enough sight in the 1880s, as not everyone could afford this new mode of travel. However, soon enough, the sight of endless columns of oxen-led wagon trains became a symbol of a bygone era and an emblem forever etched in American legend.